we now have from Washington Mr. Nizar Farsakh, Professor of International Law. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Now, Mr. Farsakh, thank you so much for joining us. And what legal frameworks govern the actions of states in targeting individuals such as Yahya Sinwar in conflict zones, and how do these frameworks apply in this case?
Well, definitely there's the principle of proportionality. That is, the military needs to focus on the military purpose and consider different options, and then go with the option that is likely to result in the least amount of civilian casualties. So that, of course, could be subjective. One country might think it has a certain option that works better than the other. But in the case of Israel, it's hard to argue that they were actually trying to avoid civilian casualties, given the disproportionate number of civilians that get killed every time Israel targets a person. So that's the general rule, international rule.
Mm-hmm. How does the international law address the principles of proportionality and the necessity in military operations, and especially in the context of civilian casualties, as you spoke about this during operations like those in Gaza, and how the international community is really acting towards that?
That is the challenge with international law, that ultimately it is the law that sovereign nations agree on and agree to abide by. But in the end, it doesn't mean that states actually go ahead and do that. What happens is any country or any group can make an argument that there has been a breach of international law. They can take it to the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court and make the legal argument. But then, even if they prove that that's the case, as was the case with Israel and the issue of genocide, it's up to states to take that legal verdict and do something with it. Just like Britain, for example, stopped the transfer of 5 types of weapons, I believe, to Israel, and likewise Spain and other countries. So it becomes an instrument that makes that justifies the actions of states.
What implications does the potential assassination of Sinwar have for the legal status of Hamas as a non-state actor under international law?
It doesn't change anything. Just we don't know who the head of Hamas is. Hamas will have to announce who the new leader is, but that does not change the status of Hamas as a political party or as a militant movement either.
Here I might raise also the question of the international law regarding the humanitarian aspects and the influence of the law and the accountability of Israel in targeting civilians.
Yes, so this has to do with the responsibility of states in protecting civilians and avoiding civilian harm in war. But in addition to that, the fact that Israel controls the borders of the Gaza Strip, it is responsible for making sure that humanitarian aid, water, electricity, all of the necessities of life are catered to. And Israel has not been doing that. It's imposed a siege for 17 years, which is illegal. They can make a siege to, for example, a fortified military installation, but they cannot lay siege to a city or a place where there are civilians and cause starvation and cause medical harm because of lack of medicine and what have you. That is against international law. But of course, Israel makes the argument that it is doing its best, quote unquote, in the support or providing humanitarian aid. But of course, the evidence is to the contrary.
If I may ask you also, or reiterate the question in other words, how might the actions of Israel in this context be scrutinized under the international law?
It's obvious from the number of trucks that actually make it to the Gaza Strip, the fact that there has been incidents where the Israeli authorities stopped trucks from going in, or in fact there were some Israeli civilians who stopped trucks and the Israeli authorities did not do anything about them, right? So they allowed the Israeli civilians to attack those trucks. All of that shows intention of denying Palestinians their rights to humanitarian aid, as opposed to the claim that Israel is doing its best. If it was doing its best, it wouldn't have allowed these actions to happen.
Now, what role do you see for international legal institutions such as the International Criminal Court in addressing the potential violations of laws stemming from such situations?
Well, they already did by stating that Israel is an occupying power, by stating that there are credible grounds for believing that there is a genocide that's happening. And what's important in that is you don't need to prove that there is a genocide. Rather, you need to prove that there is a reasonable accounts to believe that there is a genocide for countries to be obligated to stop sending weapons or supporting the genocide. What they could do more is to actually give more specifics on what states can or cannot do or should not do. Specifics on what does that, what does not aiding genocide entail in specific steps.
Mr. Nizar, what or how do the international law, deal with targeted assassinations, as some of which happened or took place by the Israeli forces? How do the international law deal with those cases?
There isn't anything specific on targeted assassinations. It falls within the same rubric of avoiding civilian casualties. So long as a person is militarily active, even if a soldier is not even carrying a weapon and is moving around, they are still a legitimate target. The extrajudicial killings would be for civilians or people who are not combatants. You are not allowed to kill them, of course. You are allowed to arrest them if you have suspicion that they are involved, but you may not target them for killing. But military or combatants, people who are known to be combatants, even if they're not carrying weapons, you may target them. The question becomes, the only limit is how much you work on avoid civilian casualties. If you're not trying to avoid civilian casualties, then that's a crime.
Then targeting more than 42,000 civilians, unarmed civilians, most of them children and women who are definitely unarmed. How would the international law, or how is the international law supposed to be dealing with such a case?
Well, it wouldn't look at the whole number. It would look incident by incident. That is, a certain attack, was that attack lawful or not? The general number, the fact that there is a very big proportion of the deaths being civilian is evidence, or is circumstantial evidence, let's say, that Israel is not doing its best to avoid civilian casualties. So it's just the fact that the number or the proportion of civilian casualties is so much higher than any other conflict that it makes it very hard for Israel to argue that it is doing its best, because other countries have had conflicts and they haven't had that number of, or that proportion of civilians being casualties. So it's circumstantial. It's not something specific that is directly incriminating.
And what is exactly the number of casualties that will enable the international law to interfere and find a way to deal with such casualties? What is exactly the number?
Unfortunately, there isn't a number. That's what I was trying to say, is that from an international law perspective, it doesn't give an absolute number. It tries to prove intent, tries to show that even if you are trying, you say that you're trying to avoid civilian casualties, there is evidence that you're not, then you're incriminated. It's not about the number, but about the general or the total.
So let me here take my questions or reiterate my questions in other words. What would make the international law interfere, or the international community interfere through the process of the international laws in such cases, or in the killing or the genocides that are committed? When does the international law say that those are genocides, those are just killing or casualties of war? What exactly? Where is the criteria? What is the criteria of the international law in these cases?
So, what would
when would the international
Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, establishes if a crime has been committed, if a human right has been violated, and then countries, states, take actions accordingly. So organizations can sue their country, can sue their, let's say, Ministry of Defense if it sold weapons to Israel, knowing that Israel is committing, or there is reasonable evidence that it's committing genocide. So the law itself becomes an instrument. What makes a change is the actions that states take because of or using those legal instruments. Because in international law, there is no executive branch that applies the verdict of the court the way we have in any country. So it is really up to the states, the countries. So we saw how, for example, in Rwanda, nobody moved because nobody cared about Rwanda. And likewise, in the problems that are happening in Congo and Sudan, it's really a question of what the global community cares about and what it pays attention to. Just like, for example, the difference between how they deal with Ukraine compared to Palestine. Like, it's exactly the same case, and yet still the international community behaves differently because of its own, national interest calculations.
Yes. So it's upon the criteria put by the international community at large. That was Mr. Nizar Farsakh, the Professor of International Law from Washington. Thank you so much, Mr. Nizar, for your time and your valuable insight.